Welcome back to another video, everybody. Deer season is long in the rear view. It's now springtime and fishing season is in full swing. To get ready for fishing season, I've decided I'm gonna build a few brand new rods for myself. In today's video, we're gonna be building an ultralight spinning rod. The blank is 6'6", and I wanna cut it down to 5 feet. The second thing that is gonna be unique about it is the grips. I bought these foam grips. I've actually never built a rod with foam grips. I've always used cork. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. How do we ream? How does it go reaming it out? But I need to get the spacing correct on my grips because I don't need a lot of lower grip. What I'm thinking about is actually cutting this in half and somehow shaving it down so that it tapers a little bit better, and I just have almost like a oversized winding check at the bottom of the reel seat. Speaking of the reel seat, another thing I'm gonna do in this video is cut the reel seat down. This is gonna be built for this reel. I've got a Lew's ultralight spin cast reel, and if I unwind it just to where the reel will come out of its seat, I wanna cut this excess off. We don't need that. And that just makes the lower grip longer. So I want to cut that. That's over a ½ inch probably. I want to cut that off. And then I've got a kind of an interesting guide set up here. I can't remember the exact sizes. This might be like a number 10. And then I think this is an 8. And then this is a 6. And then these are all 5s. And the tip is a 5. But you can see that these little guides here, I'll put one in my palm. These are not spin cast guides. You know, technically you can use whatever kind of guide you want when you're building your rod. It's your rod. You can do whatever you want. But I'm not going from some giant open guide to a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller, where you might have these kind of guides that stand off of the blank all the way out to the end. I'm going with these tight, close little guides that'll be very close to the blank. I've got 5 of them that I can use. I actually have a few more in my builder's kit. It's gonna be a fun little rod. I've got a few things we gotta figure out. I need to find the spine of this blank. I need to cut 1.5 feet off. We need to make some trimming on that reel seat. We've got a lot to do, so let's get started. First thing we're gonna do here with the rod is we're gonna find the spine. So to find the spine, what I do is I set the heel of the rod on the floor, and then I'll hold my index finger parallel to the floor and lay about 6 inches below the tip. I'll lay it on my index finger. And then I'll take my other hand, use my index finger parallel with the floor and parallel with my other finger, and I'll push the rod. And the rod is gonna spin into its natural state. There's a natural spine and it'll spin. What I'll do, I'll show you here, what I'll do is take my thumb and roll the rod, and you'll feel it kind of jump into position. It'll jump into 2 positions, one where the spine is facing down and one where the spine is facing up. The one that snaps into position the most, that's the real spine of the rod. And this is the position that you want to build the rod in to get the optimal performance so that you're not getting a twist or anything like that. When it comes to a casting rod, you want to put your guides on the top of the spine, and when it's a spinning rod, the guides are going to go on the bottom of the spine. In this case today, building a spinning rod, the guides will go on the bottom. Let me get my China marker and get this one marked up. I've got my fingers in place. I'm going to press on the rod, find the spine, and then what I do is I put my thumb on the back side, and then I come with my China marker, put in this little white mark on the back of the spine. This is the top of the rod. The next thing we need to do is cut this rod down. So we need to take 18 inches off of it. Okay, here's 18 inches. I'm gonna use my China marker and give it a good mark. To cut this off, I'm gonna get my Dremel out. We'll take a blade and we'll just snap that right off. What I need to do next is figure out how to get this butt cap on. It's not a 2-piece, which means I have to slide this over the end, and the hole is really small, so it's going to require some reaming. I've got my reamers. I've never reamed out foam. It is pretty hard. I think it'll ream out decently, but let's get the drill in the reamer and we'll see how it goes. Just kind of mocking this up to see if this is the smallest reamer that I have. I think I'm going to need to start with this one. Uh-oh. That is not what I wanted to do. Oh well, it's not the end of the world. I'm just gonna run with it. It's gonna work just fine. Before we get way more than we need, I'm gonna kind of do this one in stages and mock it up. See, there you go. It's like, that's enough right there. That's almost too much. I like it where it's a little bit tighter, but with the glue, it's gonna be just fine. Okay, butt cap good. Now we need to work on our foregrip. Like I said, I think I want it to be a lot shorter. I'm gonna go ahead and bite the bullet, cut this thing in half. I'm wondering if I get this piece of the grip kind of lodged onto the reamer and then spin it and hold this sand block, that will sort of lathe it down. That works amazingly well. Before we take off too much, I want to mock fit it. That looks pretty good. What I'm doing here is just trying to get it as flat as I can on that side that I cut. That's nice right there. Remember, we're going to cut about a ½ inch of that off, so I'm overlapping it there. This is going to go more or less to the end. Let's see what kind of distance that is. That's basically 7 inches of grip from the very end of the rod to the center of the reel. So what I'm going to do is take my China marker, mark the bottom, mark the top of the reel seat. And now I know I need to ream until the grip gets down to about right here. So that's as far as it goes. I need a little bit more. I could probably push it down all the way. I want to ream it a little bit more so that it gets some, we'll be able to get some good glue in there. A little bit more. I think that's going to work. This is what we're looking like so far, guys. Next, we're going to cut this reel seat. So remember, what I was doing is loosening it until the edge of the reel just pops out. I'm going to take some tape, put it around right here. Need the tape to be as square as it can be. Don't want to cut it crooked. Tighten that down to get it out of the way. I cut right along that tape line. Take that off. That worked great. Now we can see it's starting to come together. Next thing we need to do is get the reel seat fitted correctly, loose. So what we do is take our tape, take our masking tape, and we'll wrap it in about 3 positions, like basically under here, and under here. And that'll give it the support it needs, and then we'll of course glue it all together. I'm gonna leave this grip on. I'm gonna take this off. We're gonna wrap some tape. The good thing is with the tape, you can put a bunch on there, and if it's too much, you can just take it off. You want to put about as much tape as it takes so that the reel seat will slide down over the tape, but not too firm, but also not loose. See how our tape's doing. That's too loose. It's close, but it's too loose. It probably needs 5 more wraps or so. It's too much, which I did on purpose. That's perfect. I'm gonna remark below our grip because we're about to have to put some glue on, and to get this grip on, I've got to slide it up like that and then lower it down over the glue before I can put the tape, the tape down here or down here. The glue that we're going to be using is a 2-part epoxy. This is Pro Paste. Use equal parts of each, mix it together thoroughly, and that's your adhesive. I'm just using the back end of, this is an old used up brush. You got to figure your glue is going to be twice as much as whatever I've put there, because we got to get equal parts of that. Even that is way more glue than we're going to need for this whole rod. Once we get our glue mixed, We're just gonna put this rear grip, then we're gonna get back to doing our reel seat. Once we get all the tape on the reel seat, we'll glue it down and we'll do the rear butt grip. One thing I haven't mentioned is putting on winding checks. I am gonna put these on. These are just little finishing pieces. It'll go up against the rear grip, and then I'm gonna put one facing the other way that'll go up against the butt cap. So we're just gonna take some glue. It's not gonna take much. Here along there. And then we're gonna twist. Till it's in position. And I like taking my tool, getting all this excess glue off, and I'm gonna work that winding check down. Good, we're in good shape. Let's get some more tape so we can get our reel seat down. Then we'll finish gluing everything on, and this rod will be ready to sit overnight. Perfect. Now remember, this reel seat needs to point straight down with the spine of the rod. See how the tape serves as a spot where the glue can kind of bulk up against? I like to make sure that you've got glue that touches all the way across. Like, you don't want to have a bunch of glue here and then a blank open space of rod and then a bunch of glue down there. I like it to be tied together. It'll just make the whole rod more solid and less likely to fail on you. I'm gonna make sure to get some good glue in this gap between the last bit of tape and the grip. Just give a little extra hold on that grip. Okay, we got enough glue there to get started, so I'm gonna bring the reel seat down. I need to get a lot of glue off there. We're going to get some glue in the top there, and then we're going to run this winding check down. Perfect. Now we're going to glue the butt. I'm going to put some, since we have the hole in the rear, I'm going to put some in the rear where it overlaps the blank and the butt, help hold it in place even more. And we need to get that winding check run down in place. Now there's a few little bits where there's some excess. All right, it's the next day and our grips, butt cap, and reel seat are all dried and ready to go. You can see in the background I put together a couple of casting rods as well. But for our little spinning rod, we're ready to set the guides. What I found to be the best technique to set guides is to use these rubber bands. These rubber bands are just cut pieces of this tube. You just take your tool basically and slice off a thin little piece. And I messed that one up, but it'll create a little rubber band, not unlike the rubber bands that are used for people with braces like me. What we need to do first is preload the rod with a bunch of rubber bands, so I'm going to start sliding some on down. We need one for every guide. We also need one for the hook keeper. We're going to need at least 7 or 8. I'm going to probably put 8 on here. Here's a tip to keep in mind. With the rubber bands down here on the heavier part of the rod, they fit pretty snugly. But as you get farther closer to the tip, the rubber band gets looser and looser. at some point, like here, it's really loose and that's not gonna hold anything. So in order to get the rubber band to hold, you have to double it over. And now I can slide that to any part of the rod and it's gonna be tight enough to hold our guide in place. We got all our rubber bands set, including one for a hook keeper. And before we put any guides underneath these to start positioning them, we actually need to put our tip top guide on. Got our tip top guide here. Let's just make sure that it fits. It does. Very good. Now in this case, we want the guide pointing straight down versus a casting rod where it would be sticking up like this with the reel seat on the top. What I need to do is get a little sliver of glue to put in there, and then we'll take the lighter, heat it up so that it melts, slide it over the end. So I got this glue stick that comes with most rod building kits. It's going to cut a thin piece, a very thin piece cut there. It goes down into the guide. I'm going to hold the guide with my tweezers. Take my lighter. You don't need to be too close to it. It'll start to bubble out whenever it's hot enough. Now you can always move the position later by heating it up again and then adjusting it. I've got the spine pointing straight up on our rod holder here, and then I've got our guide pointing straight down. That should be perfect. It'll dry in just a couple of seconds. Probably dry right now. Okay, so our tip top's good to go. Now we need to start placing our guides along the rod. We're going to start by just getting the guides onto the rod. We'll worry about the perfect positioning later on. I have a strong hunch that second guide's not going to be 3 inches from the first one, so I'm going to go ahead and space it out a little bit. I went ahead and put the reel in the rod. This will help keep it pointed straight down. Okay, we got them in position. I'm going to run the string from the reel through the guides. I'm wanting to see how the string flows off of the reel and through especially the first 2 guides. I know it's hard to see here, but what you don't want is the string coming through the first guide and making a kink in the line. The first guide on a spinning reel serves as a collector for the second guide. So you want the string to be able to come off the reel to the second guide as straight as possible. And to the degree that your first guide is causing a kink in the line, what you might do is move the guide a little bit to the right. Okay, we got our first guide in a good spot. Now what we need to do is move the rest of our guides. For the positioning of the rest of our guides, I'm going with just honestly like kind of a visual tapered look where every guide as we get closer to the tip is a little bit closer to the previous guide. We've got about 2.5 inches or 3 there, about 4 inches there, 5.5 inches there, 6 inches there, 7 inches there, 8 inches, 8.5 there. Proper science would be to bend the rod and follow the flow of the rod so that you've got a nice even distribution of sections of string. But for our little spinning rod, this is going to be plenty close enough, I promise. And that completes the initial step of setting the guides in their position. Hardest step building a rod, undoubtedly wrapping of guides. What I'm going to do is a close-up video of wrapping a guide help you when you're building your own custom rod. Now before we actually get started wrapping, you can see that the foot of the guide is coming down. It's got a taper. This is going to help us get the thread up over the foot of the guide. Notice sometimes when you're wrapping that the thread will want to jump under the foot. The foot sticks off from the guide just a little bit. Sometimes that can be enough for thread underneath. But to get started with your wrapping, I've got the thread here coming up from the threader, going around the back and then coming up and going down the rod to the tip. But we need to get started and get a little bit of bite on this thread. So I'm going to take this piece of thread that's in my index finger and roll it over. And then I'm using my right hand that's far away in the screen and I'm pulling away to keep some tension. Now I'm going to take my index finger and thumb, pinch the rod while keeping tension with my right hand and almost rolling with it. I'm going to spin the rod away from me and it's going to roll over that tagline thread. See that? Okay, now we've got a few wraps started, and that's enough to where the line's going to hold itself in place. And I'm going to take my snips and cut that tagline off. Notice that we're out about 1/4 inch from the end of the foot of the guide. That's a little bit far. I'm going to take my burnish tool and work the threads back towards the foot of the guide just a little bit. Started a little farther than I typically would want, but more or less we're in a good position. I'm going to keep an eye on the spacing of the thread. We're just going to keep on wrapping. Now that we've got it over the foot of the guide, I'm going to get a few wraps here. You can see we've got this gap. I'm going to use my burnish tool again. I'm going to come work the threads down next to each other. See how much better that looks? I just made another wrap. See how it made that gap? I'm going to take my slide. I'm not going to back the camera out to show you, but there's a slide for the thread as it comes up to the rod, and that helps with the angle. So I'm pulling my slide back so that we get a little tighter. I'm just taking my time. Again, I'm going to bring my burnish tool up. You can do some of this burnish work after you've threaded the whole guide. I like to do it along the way. You get a better result that way. Now we don't need to bring thread all the way to the end, but we do need to bring it into where this rubber band is sitting. So I'm going to bring my snips up, carefully cut the rubber band off. We're going to bring our threads to about right here. And so that means we've got 4 or 5 wraps left. I'm going to give it one more. Now what we need to do is prep for the finish of this wrap. What I'm going to do is find my tag that I cut off earlier. I'm going to fold it completely in half. What that's going to do is make a loop. What we want to do is lay the loop across the back side. I like to use the back side. It's the most hidden. It also is going to typically give the best fit. If you put it next to the guide itself, there might be a gap. You might not grab it. Got it. Once you've got it once, you can let it go and just keep spinning. You're going to get 3 or 4 wraps. And then take your finger, hold, come down about 4 inches. I'm taking my snips and I'm going down about 4 inches and cutting our thread. Now I'm going to take our thread and I'm going to put it through the loop. I know you can't see it on the camera right now, but I'm putting it through the loop that we created. Now I'm going to grab the ends of our loops. You need to grab both ends, and I'm going to pull to my left. You see that loop cinch up. It's going to bring that thread with it. It's taking it underneath, and that gives us a good tight fit. Pull it a little extra tight. I'm going to come up with my snips and cut it as closely as I can. Now I'm going to, with my burnish tool, I'm going to come back, do a little bit of finish work, make sure all the edges square, the spacing I liking. Now we have a completely wrapped guide is ready for epoxy. This step with every one of the guides on your rod. The second most part of building a rod, epoxying the guides. What I'm doing before we apply epoxy is our final Varnish of the threads. I want to make sure that threads are exactly where I want them. There's no odd gaps or anything, because those gaps will show up when the epoxy dries. This guide looks really good. Unlike the epoxy that we use to put on a reel seat and grips, this is a Pro Coat thread finish. It's a lot thinner, so it dries very, very clear. What you do is put equal parts of each, the resin and the hardener, into a little cup and then mix it up. This is a cup that's been used several times. You can see the excess we have in there. I'm going to use this again. It's dried really flat rather than waste another cup. I usually, when I'm building a rod, can see that the line, the plunger is about at 3.5 milliliters. And I'm going to use 1 milliliter of each part. So 2 notches here. That should be enough to do this little rod. So 2 notches on each. What I do is just watch the plunger as we go. 1, 2, 1, 2. I'm going to use a clean mixing stick. We'll mix this thoroughly. Once you got everything mixed nicely, got our rod in the turner. You can see there's some air bubbles in the epoxy. We can get those out later if they stay. I'm going to take a fresh brush. I'm going to get just a bit of epoxy on the end, and I'm going to hold it over the threads. And then I'm going to start to spread it out. I know I'm going to need more on this one, so I'm going to get another dot of it. Keep in mind that the epoxy will spread itself. You don't want to overdo it. You'll learn once you do a few rods about how much you need. I like to let the spinner do most of the work. So I'm just going to hold the in place and let the spinner do its turning, and I'll move the epoxy slowly. I'm going to bring it all the way to the edges. I want the epoxy to go over the edge of the thread, so it needs to overlap the thread and hold it just over the edge. And I'll do the same thing back towards the guide itself. And that is more or less a completely epoxied guide. If you have any air bubbles left, take your lighter, hold it below it, light it, wave it. I'm waving it back and forth underneath. And that will get rid of any bubbles that are left. You can see I had a couple bubbles and now they're gone. I'm going to keep working on the rest of the guides. We'll come back to this guide and I'll show you what it looks like after a few minutes of spinning in case we need to do any touch-up work. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes. We're back at our first guide. You can see that we've got the epoxy going over the end of the thread onto the blank here. We've also got the epoxy going over the thread onto the blank on this end. Also notice when the guide comes around, there's epoxy underneath the riser of the foot, right there. I'll let you see it again without my stick in the way. There. That's a good sign. You don't want it to be a bunch, but you want a little bit, and that means that the epoxy is saturated all the way underneath the foot along the rod blank, and that's going to give you good adhesion. The thread helps hold it, but really the epoxy is what holds everything together. The other thing you're looking for is that the epoxy looks smooth. If you can see the threads, like if it looks bumpy or rough and it doesn't have, see how the shine that we have is very good and smooth, and it doesn't look like the ridges of the thread. If you see the ridges of the thread, you don't have enough epoxy and you need to add a little bit more. In this case, we have good dispersion of epoxy, and this is going to dry quite nicely. I'm going to check the rest of the guides on this rod. We're going to let it keep spinning. We'll let it spin about 12 hours before we stop. It'll take about a week for this rod to fully cure. Hopefully this helps in your custom rod building. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.